On the coldest Christmas Eve, a feared mafia boss saw something he never expected. A little girl, barely 6, sat alone in a crowded hall, clutching empty hands as other children unwrapped gifts. Her whisper cut through the noise and straight into his soul. Santa forgot about me. That night, the lion of the underworld found the one thing he didn't know he was missing. A reason to protect, a reason to change, and a family worth saving. Before we dive into this unforgettable Christmas tale, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Grab a warm drink, settle in, and let's step into a story where even the coldest heart can be changed by the smallest soul. The first snow of December drifted like torn scraps of paper across the cracked asphalt as Leo the Lion Moretti stepped out of his black sedan, the chill biting through even the cashmere of his coat, his expression as sharp and cold as the night itself, for he was a man who moved entire cities in silence. Yet tonight he was only a reluctant donor arriving at a school's charity party, his presence a favor to a politician he barely respected. The scent of gingerbread and hot chocolate hit him as soon as he pushed through the double doors into the gymnasium, a scent that belonged to childhood memories he never had, and his steel-gray eyes swept the riot of paper snowflakes, blinking fairy lights, and squealing children with the same detached vigilance he used in a boardroom full of rivals. His dark suit immaculate, a black scarf at his throat hiding the pale line of an old blade scar, while behind him Marco, tall and watchful in his leather jacket, stood with his hands folded loosely, but his gaze scanning every corner as if the gym were an ambush site. The laughter of children struck Leo as a foreign dialect, something his soul could not quite translate, and he stood near the tree whose plastic needles glistened under the colored bulbs, his posture making even the volunteer teachers step aside, because the lion carried an aura that did not belong in a place strung with tinsel. And then, just as his attention began to drift to the stack of envelopes that would prove his donation had been delivered, his gaze snagged on a small, unmoving figure in the farthest corner where a tower of metal chairs cast long shadows, and there, half hidden from the revelry, sat a girl so still she looked carved from pale winter light, her blonde hair catching the glow of a paper lantern like a fragile halo, her thin shoulders wrapped in a faded woolen dress, her black shoes scuffed to the point, and the toes were gray, her mittenless hands curled together in her lap as if she were trying to hold in all the warmth she had left. Leo felt an unexpected tightness stir in his chest, something not unlike the pang of an old wound, and without realizing it, he shifted a step, then another, keeping behind a row of cardboard snowmen, as if a man who had stared down armed rivals without blinking could not quite walk openly toward one lonely child. As he drew closer, the shrill cheer of the party dulled, replaced by the softest, thinnest voice. He almost thought he had imagined it, until he heard her whisper to the empty air in front of her folded hands, "Santa forgot about me." The words breaking not in a sob, but in the flat, resigned tone of a heart too young to have already learned disappointment. Leo, who had seen men beg for their lives with tears streaming down their faces, felt the whisper strike harder than any blade, and he stood for a beat too long, staring as if trying to memorize that fragile profile framed by falling golden strands, until a woman burst in through the side door, cheeks flushed from the cold, hair slightly unpinned by the wind, clutching a threadbare coat around her slender frame, her expression apologetic as she hurried across the floor and dropped to her knees beside the child. Isabella, though he did not yet know her name, murmuring soft reassurances and drawing the girl into her arms, a mother's embrace both protective and heartbreakingly humble. Leo's eyes, used to reading people for weaknesses, caught not weakness but quiet strength in the woman's tired smile as she coaxed her daughter to join the others. Yet the girl's blue eyes, luminous and solemn, turned once toward Leo with a gaze so direct and searching, it felt like a small, silent plea cast across a chasm of darkness between their worlds. That single look stayed with him as the evenings Speeches droned on as applause rattled around the gymnasium as the fake snow on the stage sparkled under fluorescent lights, stayed with him when he finally strode out past the donation table into. The first snow of December drifted like torn scraps of paper across the cracked asphalt as Leo the Lion Moretti stepped out of his black sedan, the chill biting through even the cashmere of his coat, his expression as sharp and cold as the night itself, for he was a man who moved entire cities in silence. Yet tonight he was only a reluctant donor arriving at a school's charity party, his presence a favor to a politician he barely respected. The scent of gingerbread and hot chocolate hit him as soon as he pushed through the double doors into the gymnasium, a scent that belonged to childhood memories he never had, and his steel-gray eyes swept the riot of paper snowflakes, blinking fairy lights, and squealing children with the same detached vigilance he used in a boardroom full of rivals, his dark suit immaculate, a black scarf at his throat hiding the pale line of an old blade scar, while behind him Marco, tall and watchful in his leather jacket, stood with his hands folded loosely, but his gaze scanning every corner as if the gym were an ambush site. The laughter of children struck Leo as a foreign dialect, something his soul could not quite translate, and he stood near the tree whose plastic needles glistened under the colored bulbs, his posture making even the volunteer teachers step aside, because the lion carried an aura that did not belong in a place strung with tinsel. And then, just as his attention began to drift to the stack of envelopes that would prove his donation had been delivered, his gaze snagged on a small, unmoving figure in the farthest corner where a tower of metal chairs cast long shadows, and there, half hidden from the revelry, sat a girl so still she looked carved from pale winter light, her blonde hair catching the glow of a paper lantern like a fragile halo, her thin shoulders wrapped in a faded woolen dress, her black shoes scuffed to the point, and the toes were gray, her mittenless hands curled together in her lap as if she were trying to hold in all the warmth she had left. Leo felt an unexpected tightness stir in his chest, something not unlike the pang of an old wound, and without realizing it, he shifted a step, then another, keeping behind a row of cardboard snowmen, as if a man who had stared down armed rivals without blinking could not quite walk openly toward one lonely child. As he drew closer, the shrill cheer of the party dulled, replaced by the softest, thinnest voice. He almost thought he had imagined it, until he heard her whisper to the empty air in front of her folded hands, "Santa forgot about me," the words breaking not in a sob, but in the flat, resigned tone of a heart too young to have already learned disappointment. Leo, who had seen men beg for their lives with tears streaming down their faces, felt the whisper strike harder than any blade, and he stood for a beat too long, staring as if trying to memorize that fragile profile framed by falling golden strands, until a woman burst in through the side door, cheeks flushed from the cold, hair slightly unpinned by the wind, clutching a threadbare coat around her slender frame, her expression apologetic as she hurried across the floor and dropped to her knees beside the child, Isabella, though he did not yet know her name, murmuring soft reassurances and drawing the girl into her arms, a mother's embrace both protective and heartbreakingly humble. Leo's eyes, used to reading people for weaknesses, caught not weakness, but quiet strength in the woman's tired smile as she coaxed her daughter to join the others. Yet the girl's blue eyes, luminous and solemn, turned once toward Leo with a gaze so direct and searching, it felt like a small, silent plea cast across a chasm of darkness between their worlds. That single look stayed with him as the evening's speeches droned on, as applause rattled around the gymnasium, as the fake snow on the stage sparkled under fluorescent lights, stayed with him when he finally strode out past the donation table into. First lunge deflected by Leo's forearm. The second thug's wrist caught and twisted until the knife clattered to the floor. The thud of a body slammed against the door jamb, the dull crack of a fist meeting bone. The short gasp of pain followed by silence as one assailant slumped to the floor and the other stumbled down the stairs, cradling a broken arm and cursing as he fled. The whole encounter had taken less than half a minute, yet in that span Isabella saw the man she had feared reveal not the cruelty of a predator, but the unyielding control of a protector. And as the tension ebbed, she noticed for the first time that his knuckles were bleeding where the skin had split on impact. Leo stooped, retrieved the doll which had fallen during the scuffle but remained miraculously unmarred, and turned back to Sophia with a look that softened the hard planes of his face, holding the package out once more, as he told her in a tone gentler than any she had heard, that sometimes Santa needed a little help delivering gifts. The child's fingers trembled as she took it, her blue eyes lifting to his as though seeking permission to believe in kindness again, while Isabella watched silently, torn between gratitude and caution, aware that the man standing in her doorway was both danger and safety woven into one. The brief stillness that followed was filled by distant sirens and the muted hum of the city beyond the snow, and Leo inclined his head to Isabella in a gesture that was almost old-fashioned courtesy before stepping back toward the hallway, leaving behind the faint scent of winter air and the unspoken promise that neither mother nor child would be left defenseless in the darkness of this city. As Leo turned to go, Sophia's small voice followed him, shy yet sincere. "Thank you, Santa's friend." Out on the landing, Marco's quiet words cut through the muffled, snow-laden air. "Boss, though, I know you care about the girl now. That makes her a target." The streets glistened under a sheen of melting snow as Leo's car glided through the quiet city night, Marco's warning still hanging in the air like frost, yet Leo's gaze remained fixed on the darkened skyline, a faint tension in his jaw betraying the thoughts circling in his mind. He had spent years fortifying his empire against betrayal and ambition, but never against the vulnerability of caring for someone who had nothing to offer but innocence. The following days saw him returning to the modest apartment on Maple Street, under the guise of making sure the hallway was repaired after the earlier incident, his appearances timed carefully so as not to draw unnecessary attention. But his visits became a steady rhythm, arriving sometimes with small things, a bag of groceries, a fixed hinge for a creaking cupboard, a box of crayons for Sophia, acts that felt foreign to a man accustomed to solving problems with ledgers and bullets. Isabella, at first stiff and watchful whenever she opened the door, gradually began to allow him into their cramped kitchen, where she would pour coffee into mismatched mugs while her eyes searched his face as if to discover the reason behind his unexpected kindness, and though she rarely asked questions, her guarded silences carried as much weight as any words. Sophia, however, transformed in his presence, her initial shyness dissolving into bursts of soft laughter whenever he tried, awkwardly but with genuine effort, to assemble the lopsided puzzle she had been given by a neighbor, or when he read from her worn storybook, his deep voice lending strange gravity to tales of princesses and faraway kingdoms. Yet even as warmth slowly edged its way into those small domestic moments, the streets began to hum with speculation, whispers passing through the back rooms of gambling dens and pool halls, that the lion had been seen visiting a rundown tenement where a woman and child lived, whispers that crawled their way into the ears of rivals who had long sought a chink in his armor. Marco noticed the growing attention and spoke more than once of the danger, but Leo only replied that no one would dare cross the line he had drawn, though in private he caught himself glancing more often than before at the shadows pooling under street lamps near the apartment. A new kind of vigilance born not of paranoia for his own safety, but of the unfamiliar weight of responsibility for two people who had never asked to be caught in the orbit of his world. Isabella too sensed the unseen currents shifting beyond their doorstep. One evening as she stood by the window watching the snow fall, she admitted quietly that his presence had begun to feel less like an intrusion and more like a shield. Yet her voice trembled with the knowledge that shields often drew arrows meant for others, and Leo, hearing her words, felt a stir of resolve deep in his chest, as if he had silently vowed to make that shield unbreakable. Sophia, oblivious to the darker implications, had started saving scraps of colored paper from old magazines to craft a tiny lion's mane for the doll she had named Hope, declaring proudly that now her doll had a protector too, a declaration that made Leo pause mid-step and regard the child with an expression that was almost wonder, as though the title he had earned in the underworld could be reshaped by the hands of a 6-year-old. In the dim corridors of the city's underbelly, however, such tender notions were interpreted as weakness, and so it was that in a bar lit by a single flickering neon sign, the smell of whiskey heavy in the air, a handful of men hunched over a table scattered with cards and cigarette ash spoke in low, deliberate tones about the rumor that the lion had taken a mother and child under his wing, their voices laced with the sharp-edged amusement of predators sensing blood in the water, until the door at the back creaked open and a figure stepped in whose reasons silenced their laughter. The rival boss, whose name still carried weight in the darker districts, a man with eyes as pale as frostbite and a reputation for taking opportunities with ruthless precision. He moved toward the bar with the unhurried gait of one who had no need to prove his authority, ordered a drink without glancing at the bartender, and after taking a measured sip, raised his glass slightly toward the table of conspirators, his mouth curving into a thin, cold smile as he uttered the words that sealed the unspoken pact forming in that smoke-choked room. In that dimly lit bar, the rival boss let the rim of his glass touch his lips and said with quiet certainty, "If the lion has a weakness, we'll crush it." The rival boss's chilling toast still echoed in the smoky bar when, far away on Maple Street, the night deepened into a biting cold silence. Isabella had just finished washing the dinner plates while Sophia, curled up on the worn couch with her new doll, hummed softly to herself, the flickering lamp beside her throwing tender gold light across her little face, when a soft rustle near the door made Isabella freeze, her pulse hammering as she tiptoed closer and saw, wedged beneath the doorframe, a single sheet of coarse paper scrawled in harsh black ink that bled into the fibers. "Stay away from Moretti, or we'll take what you love most." And for a heartbeat the room seemed to tilt as the words sank in. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her fingers trembled so hard she nearly dropped the note. But then she glanced at Sophia's innocent profile, the child so absorbed in brushing her doll's hair that she hadn't noticed her mother's sudden pallor, and a cold resolve steadied Isabella's spine because nothing, not even the ghosts of the streets she'd left behind, would touch her daughter if she could help it. She locked the door, drew the curtains tight, and spent the rest of the evening sitting upright in the faded armchair, eyes fixed on the door, as though sheer will could keep the threat at bay. When dawn seeped gray and reluctant through the curtains, Leo Moretti arrived without knocking, a shadow in his long black coat and leather gloves, his eyes scanning every corner of the small apartment before he even spoke, and when Isabella silently handed him the note, his jaw tightened until a vein pulsed in his temple, but his voice remained low, steady, and edged with steel as he said, "They couldn't stay here another night." Isabella wanted to protest, to cling to the little that felt like home, but the memory of those words, "We'll take what you love most," broke any resistance she had, and she simply nodded while Sophia blinked up at them with curious eyes, clutching her doll as if it were an anchor. Within hours, Leo's men arrived, quiet, efficient shadows who packed what little the two possessed into duffel bags, and by the time dusk settled again, the three of them were in a discreet black SUV gliding through narrow back streets, leaving Maple Street behind as if it were a chapter ripped from a dangerous book. The safe house Leo chose stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, a solid brick structure with reinforced windows and a security system so advanced Isabella barely recognized the blinking panels by the door, and for the first time in months she felt a fragile sliver of safety, though her trust in Leo remained wary and taut. Sophia, however, adjusted quickly, peering around the spacious yet simply furnished rooms with a shy smile and whispering to Leo, as if confiding in a tall, watchful guardian, that it smelled like cinnamon and pine, like Christmas. That small comment drew the faintest smile from the hardened man, one that flickered across his lips before vanishing like mist, and later, as Sophia explored the shelves of storybooks in the living room, Leo crouched down to her level, his towering frame folding easily, and told her in a tone so gentle it surprised Isabella, "No one will ever hurt you while I'm breathing." The words settled in the room like a vow etched into stone, and for a fleeting moment Isabella saw not the feared lion of the underworld, but a man who had known loss too intimately and was determined not to let history repeat itself. Yet the night outside pressed against the windows like a lurking beast, and far across the city in some forgotten warehouse, orders were being given in hushed, venom-laced voices, men dispatched to watch the safe house and study the girl whose laughter had begun to thaw a mafia boss's heart. The tension seeped into the safe house, despite the locked doors and reinforced glass, like a draft that couldn't be shut out, and Isabella found herself watching Leo in the dim light of the kitchen as he stood by the counter making a late-night call to his lieutenant, his posture rigid, his tone clipped, but carrying that same quiet ferocity of a man preparing for a siege, while Sophia slept in the next room with her doll in her arms, the soft rhythm of her breathing the only tender sound in a world closing in with sharp-edged intent. As the house settled into midnight stillness, a faint glint of red trembled across Sophia's bedroom window, just for an instant, the unmistakable shimmer of a sniper's laser dot, before vanishing into the night, leaving only the whisper of danger outside the glass. The night had fallen heavy over the safe house, a bleak and restless sky pressing down on the snow-blanketed street, the silence outside so sharp it almost whistled in the ears. Marco's instincts, never dulled even by exhaustion, kept him pacing near the front windows as if some distant, invisible drum was warning him of what was coming. While upstairs, Sophia slept, clutching her new doll to her chest, her small breaths misting against the frosted glass. Inside the living room, Leo sat with a pistol laid across his thigh, staring at the flame of a single candle on the table, a muscle ticking along his jaw as though that little flame had become the focus of all his restless, simmering rage. Isabella sat across from him, arms wrapped around herself, her eyes drifting often toward the stairs where her daughter slept, trying to believe this stone-faced man could truly keep the promise he had made. The wind rattled the panes as if fingers scraped against them, and the hush of the snow seemed to deepen until the stillness was broken by the low hum of an approaching engine, headlights sliding like pale ghosts across the wall, making Marco's spine stiffen. Without a word, he shifted position, eyes narrowing, his hand sliding to the gun at his side, just as a second pair of headlights appeared behind the first, followed by the unmistakable sputter of a muffled automatic weapon. The first bullets ripped through the front window like an eruption of frozen thunder, splintering the wood frame, showering the room with shards of glass that caught the candlelight as they flew. Leo was already moving, flipping the table to its side, shouting for Isabella to get down. She threw herself to the floor, heart hammering in her ears as she heard Sophia's terrified scream from above. Marco bolted for the stairs even as another spray of bullets tore through the doorway, his boots pounding up the steps two at a time, while Leo returned fire through the shattered window, each shot cracking sharp against the bitter air, his fury exploding in a controlled, precise storm. The safe house smelled of gunpowder and old pine wood splinters. Marco burst into the upstairs room just as a stray bullet cracked the lower window frame where Sophia had been standing frozen in fear beside her bed, yanking her back and shielding her with his own body as plaster dust and glass rained down around them. Leo's roar below was more like that of the lion his enemies named him for, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than rage, an oath carved in living breath. He dropped one of the attackers who had stepped too close to the porch, the man tumbling into the snow and staining it with a dark, spreading bloom. The car's engine revved as the shooters realized their ambush had been blunted, tires spinning on the icy street as they tore away, firing a last, wild spray that stitched the porch railing and sent chips of wood flying. Silence followed almost as suddenly as the violence had erupted, broken only by Sophia's sobbing as Marco carried her downstairs, his coat torn where a bullet had grazed his arm. Leo moved through the room like a stalking wolf, scanning the street outside, his gun still raised, his chest heaving with the need to go after them right that second. But he turned instead toward Sophia and Isabella, his eyes darkened by a grim decision already forming behind them. He knelt beside the child, his rough hand surprisingly gentle as he brushed a strand of her golden hair from her wet cheek, promising her in a low, steady voice that this night would be the last time anyone dared to come for her. The snow outside continued to fall, flakes landing softly over the blood that streaked the ground, erasing the footprints as if the night itself wished to hide the horror it had just witnessed. Isabella held Sophia close, her gaze fixed on Leo as he stood, his silhouette framed against the torn curtain and the pale moonlight, and something in his posture, so still yet so charged, told her that the man she had led into her home was about to become once more the legend the streets feared. Marco, binding the scratch on his arm, muttered that he had traced the car's plates to one of the rival boss's safe depots. Leo didn't even blink before saying they would burn that depot to the ground, and anyone inside it if it meant ending the threat to Sophia, Isabel. Law's heart clenched at the icy finality in his voice, at the way vengeance had lit his eyes like cold fire. She rose, stepping between him and the door, her fingers trembling but her voice steady as she tried to reach the man beneath the fury, telling him that a war fought in the same way as his enemies fought would chain him to the life he had promised to walk away from. The candle on the table guttered and went out, leaving only the glow of the snow-blurred moon and the glitter of shattered glass, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Leo slung his holster over his shoulder and reached for the door, his face set like carved iron, but Isabella stepped into his path, eyes burning as she whispered, "If you keep living by the gun, you'll never be free, and neither will we." And for a long heartbeat, the lion's hand froze on the doorknob, while outside, far in the distance, the wail of a siren rose like a warning against the winter wind. The siren's distant wail faded into the cold night as Leo stood frozen at the door, Isabella's quiet but unwavering words still echoing in the space between them like a tolling bell, forcing the man who had lived by the gun to pause as though he'd been shot by something far deeper than bullets. Slowly, he let go of the doorknob and turned back toward her, his face still carved in iron, yet the edge of his eyes softened by a flicker of something almost fragile, something that hadn't surfaced in years. The living room smelled faintly of pine from the small, uneven Christmas tree Sophia had insisted on decorating. Its crooked branches hung with paper stars and strings of popcorn, and the glow from the colored lights painted streaks of soft red and gold across Leo's sharp cheekbones as he stepped away from the door and reached inside the inner pocket of his black coat. Isabella watched him, still standing rigid, her hand unconsciously resting on the back of the worn armchair as if bracing herself for whatever came next. But instead of pulling out a weapon, Leo withdrew a small, battered velvet pouch, its edges frayed with time and careful handling. He held it for a moment in the palm of his scarred hand, staring at it with a distant look, then loosened the string and tipped out a dull, oval-shaped metal attached to a tarnished ribbon. "My mother gave me this," he said quietly, his voice lower than she had ever heard it, the roughness carrying a strange reverence, and as he spoke he rubbed his thumb over the worn engraving, a gesture that was both absent and achingly intimate. "She said it was to remind me there's good worth fighting for. I didn't believe her then. I haven't been that man she hoped for." The admission hung in the air, startling Isabella more than the violence she had seen from him, and she saw, just for an instant, not the feared lion of the underworld, but a man stripped down to the core, revealing the wound beneath the armor. Leo's gaze shifted toward the dimly lit hallway where Sophia slept again after her sobbing had finally subsided, and when he looked back at Isabella, there was a raw plea in his expression as he added, almost as if confessing a secret to himself as much as to her, "I don't know how to be good, but I want to try, for her. I can't undo what I've done, but maybe I can learn to be the kind of man who protects without destroying." Isabella's breath hitched, her fingers curling tighter around the chair as she tried to speak, but found her throat tight with unexpected emotion. The tension between them shifted like the quiet falling snow outside, less sharp, more like the fragile stillness of a world holding its breath. Leo stepped closer, still holding the medal as if it were proof of his sincerity, and gestured toward the Christmas tree, the sight of it bringing the faintest curve to his lips. "My mother loved Christmas," he said, and then added with a trace of irony, "Never thought I'd stand under one again without a gun in my hand." The words drew a faint "Relu" Catant smile from Isabella, despite herself, and as they stood near the tree, the colored lights shimmered across their faces, softening the hard lines of Leo's features, highlighting the weary determination in his eyes and the guarded hope in hers. A quiet moment stretched between them, the air charged with things unsaid, yet felt, as if the holiday spirit itself had stolen into the room and laid a fragile peace over the two unlikely souls. For a fleeting heartbeat, Isabella could almost believe in the promise of something better, and Leo, in that silence, realized that this simple warmth was the closest he had ever been to redemption. Then, as if the world could not bear too much tenderness, the front door burst open with a jarring slam that rattled the tree's ornaments, and Marco strode in, his coat dusted with snow and his eyes alight with grim urgency, breaking the spell that had settled over the room. Marco's voice cut through the stillness like a blade as he said, breathless but steady, "Boss, they've kidnapped one of our men. They know where we're hiding." And the fragile peace of Christmas shattered in an instant, replaced by the heavy silence of a new and imminent danger. The room seemed to shrink around the three of them as Marco's words sank in, the fragile warmth of Christmas vanishing as quickly as a candle in a cold draft. Leo's expression hardened with a lethal calm that made Isabella's heart stutter, his hand slowly curling into a fist at his side, as though the entire war he had tried to contain within himself had just been unchained. He moved to the window, staring out at the street where the snow fell in a steady, silent drift, and in that quiet, Isabella saw the distance in his posture, the return of the lion who once ruled the underworld with fear instead of hope. Sophia stirred in the next room, still asleep and unaware of the storm gathering below, and that small sound seemed to steady Leo's resolve. He turned back, his voice low but sharp as steel as he told Marco to gather every man they could trust. Within the hour, the safe house became a hive of purpose. Engines warmed in the snow-choked driveway, weapons were checked with muted clicks, and the air filled with the low murmur of men preparing to risk everything. Isabella stood near the doorway, her face pale against the shadows, torn between fear and a strange, unwanted pride in the man who was stepping back into the darkness not to claim power, but to protect. Leo passed by her on his way out, pausing only long enough to meet her eyes with a look that spoke the words he could not voice, a promise without sound, and then he was gone into the winter night with Marco at his side. The convoy of dark SUVs cut through the streets like shadows gliding over ice, their headlights slicing through the falling snow as the city slept, unaware that its unseen war was about to ignite. They reached the crumbling warehouse district where the rival syndicate had dug in like a parasite, the glow of dim lamps and the faint thud of distant music leaking from behind rusted steel doors. Leo gave the order in a voice as calm as if he were discussing a business merger, and his men moved with silent precision, spreading into the alleys, positioning themselves at entrances and vantage points. Inside, the kidnapped man was bound to a chair in a corner of the wide, grimy space that stank of oil and damp wood, his face bruised, but his eyes still burning with defiance as the gang's leaders debated whether to use him as bait or leverage. The first shot cracked the night like ice breaking on a frozen lake, followed by a storm of suppressed gunfire as Leo's crew swept through the perimeter, efficient and relentless. Leo himself entered through a side door, his steps soundless but his presence unmistakable. Even in the chaos of shouting and clashing steel, the rival soldiers faltered when they recognized the man who had come for them. The battle inside was brutal but controlled. Leo. His movements precise as he cut down resistance, but always sparing those who were unarmed or merely cowering in corners. He saw in their terrified faces echoes of Sophia, and that reminder of innocence stayed his trigger finger where once there would have been no hesitation. Marco's team freed their captured brother, hauling him to his feet, just as another squad crashed through the back, and for a moment it seemed as if the worst was over, the rival boss already fleeing deeper into the maze of corridors. But then the sharp scent of gasoline hit Leo's nose, followed by the distant pop of a fuse. His eyes darted upward to the catwalk, where a desperate thug had kicked over a barrel of fuel and lit a flare, and he barked an order for everyone to get out, his voice carrying over the din like a commandment. The men surged toward the exits, dragging the rescued captive with them, while Leo covered their retreat, firing short, deliberate bursts to keep the enemy pinned. The last of his crew spilled out into the snow-dusted yard when the world behind them erupted with a deafening roar, a wall of orange flame and choking black smoke surging through the shattered windows. As the warehouse shuddered on its foundations, Marco spun back, scanning the inferno for Leo's dark silhouette, shouting his name over the roar of the fire and the distant echo of sirens, but saw nothing except collapsing beams and rolling smoke. The surviving crew clustered near the vehicles, coughing and wiping soot from their faces, their eyes fixed on the burning building as if willing their leader to emerge from the blaze. But the seconds dragged on with only the crackle of flames answering their hope. The snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes that hissed when they landed on the molten steel, and in the flickering light, Marco's jaw clenched as a knot of dread twisted in his chest. Somewhere in the distance, the rival gang's survivors fled into the night, leaving behind only the chaos they had sown, and Marco realized that the lion who had led them in had not come back out. As the last echo of gunfire died, and the flames devoured the warehouse's roof, a section of the burning wall collapsed in on itself with a thunderous crash, sending up a plume of sparks and smoke. Marco shielded his eyes, then lowered his arm to stare at the blazing ruin, his heart sinking as he muttered hoarsely, "Leo." For when the smoke began to thin, the lion was nowhere to be seen. The safe house was cloaked in a tense, icy silence that seemed to press against the windows as if the night itself were holding its breath. Isabella moved like a shadow through the narrow hallway, every step deliberate so as not to wake Sophia, who slept curled on the worn couch, clutching the little wooden angel Leo had carved for her, her small fingers tight, as if she knew the world outside was suddenly more dangerous than ever. Isabella's own heart thudded with a dread that wouldn't let her rest, the echo of the explosion that had torn Leo from them still ringing in her ears, and though she whispered silent prayers, her mind refused to believe he was gone, because she had seen in his eyes before he left that he intended to come back. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly, its rhythm mocking her helpless waiting, while Marco and two of Leo's loyal men kept watch at the windows, their faces set in grim lines but betraying the same worry that gnawed at her soul. The girl stirred in her sleep and murmured for her papa lion, and Isabella knelt by her, brushing a strand of hair from her face, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Promises that Leo would return, that everything would be all right, even as the gnawing dread in her chest threatened to break her voice. Far away in a dimly lit warehouse smelling of oil and blood, Leo awoke with his wrists bound behind a metal chair, a harsh light swinging above his head throwing jagged shadows on the concrete walls, and his first thought, even before the Iachi in his ribs or the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, was of Isabella and Sophia, wondering if they were safe, if the rivals had found them yet. The rival boss, a man called Varric with ice-blue eyes and a cruel smile, stood a few feet away, idly loading bullets into a sleek black pistol, as though it were a casual game, his words slow and deliberate as he told Leo that the syndicate had grown tired of his defiance, and that now, after the blood spilled in the lion's den, they would burn out his last weakness, the family he had dared to protect. Leo kept his gaze steady, even as one of the henchmen slammed a fist into his jaw, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a flinch. But when Varric leaned close and whispered that they knew where the girl slept, Leo's pulse spiked in a way he could not hide, and that tiny reaction made the boss grin, sensing the crack in the lion's armor. Back at the safe house, Isabella tried to keep Sophia distracted with stories of the Christmas tree they would decorate once Leo came back. her voice soft, but her eyes fixed on the front door every few seconds, as if sheer willpower could conjure him home. And when the night deepened, she slipped into the kitchen to splash cold water on her face, staring at her own reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink, telling herself she had to stay strong for the child. In the warehouse, Leo endured hours of taunts and blows, each one igniting an old scar in his soul, but his silence was unbroken, his mind clinging to the memory of Sophia's small hand in his, and Isabella's fierce gaze as she'd told him that no man could change the past, but he could still choose who to be. Outside, snow began to fall in heavy flakes, settling on the window ledges of the safe house like a cold, quiet warning. And Isabella, sitting at Sophia's bedside, listened to the creaks in the walls and the distant groans of the winter wind, her hand resting protectively on the little girl's shoulder as if to ward off any unseen threat. At that moment, Leo was forced to his knees as Varric's men held up a grainy pea. Hoto snapped from outside the safe house window, a photo of Isabella tucking Sophia in to sleep, and the sight made Leo's vision blur red with rage, his fists straining against the ropes until they bled, but he still said nothing, only breathed harder, his silence more defiant than any words. Isabella finally dozed off in the chair beside Sophia's bed, a fragile slumber born of exhaustion and worry, but the shrill ring of the old landline phone on the table snapped her awake, and she picked it up with trembling fingers, her voice barely a whisper as she said hello. On the other end was a low, rasping laugh that chilled her blood, before the voice she dreaded most came on the line. Varric himself, his tone almost amused as he told her that the lion had roared his last, that he was in their hands now, and if she truly wanted to keep Sophia alive, she would have to make a choice no mother heart could bear. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as she gripped the receiver tighter, her gaze darting to the sleeping girl as if to reassure herself she was still there, still safe, while the voice on the line grew colder, each word a blade cutting deeper as he laid out the terms. Trade yourself for the girl's safety, or we send her back to you in pieces. The line went dead with a sharp click, leaving Isabella frozen in the dim light of the safe house kitchen, the silent phone pressed against her ear, her heart pounding as though the entire world had just shifted beneath her feet. Isabella lowers the phone with shaking hands, her eyes locked on Sophia's peaceful face, and whispers to herself, "I can't let them touch her." As outside the wind howls, and a lone pair of headlights stops on the road beyond the trees, unseen by anyone inside the safe house. In the suffocating dark of the abandoned slaughterhouse, the stench of rust and old blood clung to the damp air as Isabella stepped across the cracked concrete floor, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she wondered if her captors could hear it. She clutched the worn strap of her purse as if it could anchor her courage, her every step echoing like a drumbeat of dread, and the single thought that kept her moving forward was Sophia's tiny, trembling voice pleading over the phone, a sound that hollowed her soul and hardened her resolve. A lone overhead bulb swung on its frayed wire, throwing jagged shadows across the walls where graffiti of broken crowns and blood-red lions seemed to leer at her. But she didn't stop, not even when a massive figure emerged from the dark corridor ahead, his smile like a blade, mocking her bravery, calling her bait for the lion, because she had decided before she left the safe house that she would not cry or beg. If she had to kneel to save her daughter, she would do it without shame. Behind her, the steel doors clanged shut with a finality that made the room feel like a tomb, and yet her gaze searched for even the faintest glimpse of Sophia, though she knew her daughter was not here but hidden somewhere else as leverage, and the emptiness gnawed at her. Across the room, bound to a chair with torn rope and his head bowed as though lifeless, sat Leo. His shirt was shredded, streaked with blood, but the moment she saw the faint tremor of his shoulders, she knew he was alive, and a flicker of hope burst in her chest even as the rival boss, tall, lean, his eyes pale as ice chips, sauntered out from the shadows, clapping his hands in slow, sarcastic applause. His voice dripped venom as he welcomed her, laying out the cruel bargain once more, her life for Sophia's freedom, and he held out his phone as if it were a relic of doom, replaying Sophia's recorded sobs just to watch Isabella's face blanch. But before Isabella could take the final step that would seal her surrender, a low, guttural sound, more animal than human, rumbled from Leo's chest as he suddenly lifted his head, his eyes burning like embers in the gloom, and with a sharp twist that split his own skin against the ropes. He tore one hand free, lunging at the nearest thug like a wounded lion breaking his chains. The room erupted in chaos. Gunfire cracked like thunder, sending sparks flying from the metal pillars. Isabella dove to the floor, dragging a crate as a makeshift shield, while two men rushed at Leo, who grabbed one of their guns mid-swing and shot the other point-blank before spinning to fire again. His movements raw and unpolished, but fueled by a fury so pure it unsettled even his enemies. One of the bullets shattered a hanging bulb, plunging the left side of the room into a dim, trembling half-light, and in that flicker, Isabella spotted a metal door ajar, and behind it a narrow passageway leading upward, perhaps an escape route, but a hail of bullets forced her back, splinters raining down like cruel snow. She heard a faint cry, not Sophia's, but a young boy's from somewhere deeper in the hideout, a captive of the rival gang, and her heart wrenched as she realized innocents were trapped here too. Yet she could do nothing but cover her head as Leo, still bleeding from his shoulder, pressed forward step by step through the smoke and gunpowder haze. Isabella scrambled across the floor toward him, picking up a fallen pistol, though her hands trembled so badly she could barely keep her grip. And when a thug charged at Leo's blind side, she fired her first shot, the recoil jarring her arms, but the man fell back stunned, giving Leo a crucial breath to reload. Around them, the rival boss retreated toward a raised platform, barking orders to his men to keep the woman alive. The lion fights harder for her, and in that mocking tone Isabella heard the truth. Their enemy knew the depth of Leo's feelings, and that knowledge was a weapon in itself. Leo advanced like a predator through the haze, his jaw clenched, his eyes locked on his enemy above, but each step left a smear of blood on tea. He concrete, and Isabella wanted to scream at him to stop, to live, to think of Sophia, yet her voice died in her throat as another burst of gunfire shattered the crate shielding her, and she had to roll behind a rusted pillar, clutching the pistol like a lifeline. Time seemed to slow as the battle stretched on. 2 minutes, 5, 10. But at last Leo reached the foot of the platform, his breath ragged, his gun trained upward at the rival boss who stood over him with a cruel smile, holding a pistol of his own. Isabella rose to her knees, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, her heart screaming at her to rush forward, but her body frozen by the fear that one wrong move could end Leo's life before her eyes. A hush fell over the blood-soaked room, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The last echoes of gunfire faded into the steady drip of water from a broken pipe. The rival boss tilted his head with something like admiration and said almost conversationally, "So this is the lion's heart. A woman and a child. I should have known." And then he lowered his gun just enough to smirk before raising it again, the barrel gleaming like a cold promise. Leo's grip on his own weapon tightened, his finger resting on the trigger, his eyes burning with grief and fury, and something softer that Isabella could almost feel across the distance. Love, perhaps, or hope. But then, in the moment she thought he would finally pull the trigger, he stopped, his shoulders shaking as if some invisible chain held him back. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, Leo stood there, the muzzle of his gun aimed squarely at the rival boss's heart, yet his finger refused to move. Hesitation flickered across his face, a crack in the armor of the lion, and the rival boss, sensing it, smiled darkly and whispered, "You're still just a man after all." As a hidden gunman in the shadows slowly took aim at Leo's exposed side, the freezing wind blew through the shattered windows of the warehouse as Leo stood frozen, his gun pressed to the rival boss's forehead, his finger taut on the trigger, his breaths ragged and misting in the icy air. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath with him. Isabella, crouched behind an overturned table with Sophia clinging to her arm, watched silently as if afraid even the sound of her heartbeat could tip the scales, and the rival boss, pale and trembling, stared up into the muzzle of the pistol that had already claimed so many lives, waiting for the inevitable. Yet in that suspended moment, something shifted in Leo's eyes, the rage that had kept him alive for years faltering against the memory of Sophia's small hands clutching that doll by the Christmas tree, and Isabella's quiet plea for him to break the endless cycle of blood. The gun wavered, his chest heaved, and as the rival boss braced for the shot, Leo's arm dropped with a slow finality, the weapon lowering as if it had grown unbearably heavy, his voice coming out rough and low, "No more blood tonight." And with those words the room changed, the air thick with stunned disbelief. Marco and the crew who had fought their way through the gang's defenses stepped inside cautiously, weapons still raised but their eyes fixed on their boss, as if seeing him for the first time. The man who had once been a storm of violence, now a quiet force of resolve. Leo ordered them to stand down, his voice steady, each command carrying the weight of a choice that had been years in the making. Instead of execution, he demanded surrender and dismantling. The rival boss, bewildered yet alive, dropped his own weapon, and the room exhaled as though the war had truly ended in that moment. Over the next days, true to his word, Leo turned his power not to vengeance but to transformation. What had once been an empire built on fear and blood began to shift under his relentless direction. Warehouses once used for trafficking were converted into shelters and outreach centers. The men who had followed him for years in darkness were either offered a path out or driven away, and the city that had learned to whisper his name with dread slowly started to see it as a shield instead. Isabella remained, wary but stayed close, watching him burn his old bridges one by one, amazed at the quiet determination with which he dismantled the world he had once ruled. And Sophia, too young to understand the magnitude of his choices, simply sensed the difference. The softened edge in Leo's voice when he spoke to her, the way he seemed lighter even when exhaustion shadowed his eyes. By Christmas Eve, the city's streets were hushed under a gentle snowfall, and in the small safe house, no longer a place of hiding but a home being slowly rebuilt with warmth and trust, Leo arrived in his black coat dusted with white flakes, carrying a small box wrapped in simple red paper and tied with twine. No ostentation, just sincerity. Sophia, now braver and less afraid, ran up to him, her golden curls bouncing as she clutched the doll he had once given her, and when he knelt before her and opened the box, revealing a delicate glass snow globe with a tiny lion standing protectively beside a small girl in a blue dress under falling glittery snow. Her wide blue eyes sparkled brighter than the Christmas lights strung along the modest walls. Isabella stood behind her daughter, her expression soft and warm, a smile tugging at her lips as she watched the man she had once feared sit there in the glow of the tree like he had always belonged. Leo looked up at Isabella then, his eyes unguarded in a way she had rarely seen, and though words seemed too fragile for what he felt, he said quietly but firmly, "I don't know if I can ever be the man I should have been, but I know the man I want to be. From now on, for you. For her." Isabella stepped forward and rested her hand gently over his as the soft light of the tree wrapped them both in a golden hush, and for the first time since her husband's death, she let herself believe in a future not defined by fear. Sophia carefully lifted the snow globe, cradling it as though it held more than just glass and water and glitter, as though it contained the promise of a safer world. And with the innocent honesty only a child could hold, she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, "Santa didn't forget me after all." Leo's chest tightened, his hand came up to brush a tear from her cheek, and his reply was low, steady, carrying all the weight of his vow, "Neither will I." The snow outside kept falling in silent witness, covering the blood-stained streets like a clean, unbroken blanket, as if the city itself had decided to give the lion and the little girl their Christmas miracle. As the snow globe's tiny flakes drifted down on the lion and the girl inside, Leo silently promised himself that this would be the first Christmas of many that he would spend not as the king of a criminal empire, but as the guardian of the family he had finally found,